Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for the webinar. We'll be starting right around 11 a.m. So we're just waiting for people to filter in. We could have up to 300 people today on this webinar. So we're slowly letting people in, but we should be starting right around 11 a.m. Morning, everyone who's just joined us. It is 11 a.m. by my watch. I'll give people 30 more seconds to filter in. We could have as many as 300 people here today, hopefully, fingers crossed. But yeah, we'll be getting started here extremely soon. All right, let's get started as people come filtering in. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Noble. I'm a communications specialist for the Oregon Department of Transportation, and my favorite part of my job is working with the ODOT Climate Office. So today we have 3 reps from the Climate Office, plus a division administrator to talk to you about the federal funding for electric vehicle charging. So as I said, I'm your host, and I'm going to do a little bit of some Zoom webinar 101 for anyone who's new to this. So you will notice that you all are attendees. So that means you are unable to mute yourself. You are unable to turn on your video, but that's by design. Don't worry. That's how Zoom webinars work. If you have technical difficulties, please use the chat function. So you can message everyone, and I, as the host, will see it. So if something is not working or you got a question, drop it in the chat. I can help you out. As far as run of show today, we'll be having a 30-minute presentation from our lovely panelists that you can probably see on your screen. And then we'll have about a 30-minute Q&A to follow that up. And on the next slide, I'll talk more about the Q&A stuff. And if you have any other technical difficulties, again, use the chats. I also have my personal email, my work email actually, in the chat. So if you have something else happening that you need more information on, shoot me an email during the meeting. I can get back to you. And today we'll be hearing from, like I said, 4 people from ODOT. So again, my name is Matt. I'm your host. I'm the communications person. And today we'll be hearing from 4 people. So kicking us off will be Amanda Peets, who is our division administrator for our policy, data, and analysis division. Following her will be Jillian DeMedio and Mary Brazel. Mary is our program manager for our transportation electrification program here in ODOT, and Jillian is our senior analyst for that same electrification program. And closing us out for the presentation before the Q&A will be the Climate Office Director, Suzanne Carlson. Thanks, Jillian. Right, so how to ask a question. So like I said, the Q&A will happen on the second half, so like 11:30-ish. It's pretty simple. If you're joining us on your computer this morning, you'll see this little ribbon at the bottom of your screen. You just click the Q&A button. That'll bring up a separate window, and you can please type your question in there. I see someone has actually already left a question in the Q&A, so they seem like a Zoom webinar veteran. So thank you, Kathy, for showing us exactly how it's done. So that's the first method to do that. And then during the Q&A session, I, the host, will be reading out your questions to our panelists in the order that they are received. So if at any point during the presentation you got a question, just open the Q&A window, drop it in there, we'll get to it. If we don't get to it, because like I said, there could be 300 people here today. If we don't get to it, then I'm recording everything. I'm also recording this presentation. So you'll have a recording to look at, and we'll also have all the questions that we can email all the attendees. So your question will be answered within the next probably about a week. The other method, in case you either are joining by phone this morning, or if someone is, or if we have time for audio questions, there also is the raise hand function. So on the computer, you just click raise hand. I will then allow you to unmute yourself. You can ask your question, and then I will remute you again as the host. Again, we have a lot of people and not a lot of time, so please keep your questions succinct, and we will only get to the audio portion if we've exhausted all of the written questions, because we got a lot of people. And if you're on the phone today, or if maybe if your internet goes down, you have to call back in. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A, you need to hit *9 on your keypad to raise your hand so I can see it. And then I will allow you to unmute your phone. On some phones, you may need to dial *6 to unmute, but to unmute yourself. But either way, if you're on the phone, we'll make it work. And yeah, if no one, let me just double check the chat, blah, blah, blah. Thank you for that. Perfect. Okay, so it looks like everyone is doing pretty good. So Amanda, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And welcome, everybody. Appreciate you taking the time with us here today to talk about one of my favorite topics of all time, transportation electrification. Very important thing for us to be doing for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about here in a moment. You'll hear the term transportation electrification throughout the presentation today. We're very purposeful in using that term because we know that it's not just about electrifying cars and trucks. It's also about electric micromobility, so electric bikes and scooters, and the medium and heavy duty sector of transit buses and freight trucks as well. Today's presentation will be really focused on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding, so money that comes down from the feds for this purpose. But in recognition that electrifying our system is critical to our climate future and a number of other goals that we have, ODOT is putting in and basically matching those funds. So we're getting $52 million in federal funding. We're going to double that and put over $100 million towards transportation electrification in general. So that money can be used a little bit more broadly than some of the things that you'll hear about today for what's called the NEVI funding, in that we can address some needs in more of our rural areas, our Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, low income areas, multi-unit dwellings, some of those things with some of the money that ODOT is putting in. So it gives us the flexibility to have a more broad and complete portfolio as we look at investing. So the $100 million that I mentioned, that's just the guaranteed funding. That is at a minimum what we are saying that we will put towards transportation electrification. We anticipate that we'll get more than that. We're also going to seek some federal discretionary funds, and there's match funding that's likely to come in with this as well. So pretty big and substantial portfolio investment that I'm really excited to be here with you today and share. As Matt mentioned, I'm the administrator for policy data and analysis, so I oversee the Climate Office and our statewide policy and direction. So this is really central to the key things that our agency wants to lead into. So that includes reducing greenhouse gas emissions and addressing our climate crisis. We've developed a statewide transportation strategy, which is the document there in the left, that tells us what we have to do to achieve our climate goals in the future. And over half of what we need to do at this point is to transition to cleaner vehicles and fuels, and electrification is our key path in doing that. We've also done a study, the Transportation Electrification Infrastructure Needs Analysis, which you'll hear about later, that says we need a boatload more chargers out there, a 5 times increase just in the next 5 years. So pretty substantial investments are needed. And the time to do it is now. When we invest more in charging infrastructure, people see that there's charging stations available on the routes that they travel, helps to reduce that range anxiety that folks have. People are more willing then to enter into the market. So the market's there, we can help propel it. The time is now, and we are all in and very excited to be talking with you here today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jillian to take you into the details.
Great. Thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everybody. My name is Jillian DeMedio. I'm a Senior Transportation Electrification Analyst with ODOT's Climate Office. It's great to see so much interest this morning in learning about the National EV Charging Infrastructure Program, or NEVI. I'm going to be talking about the federal requirements for this program, and then I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Mary Brazel, who will talk about our strategy for spending these dollars. First, for those who don't know, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, included $7.5 billion for EV charging infrastructure. $5 billion of these funds are what is known as formula funds, meaning they are automatically allocated to each state based on certain criteria. And this, in the case of the NEVI program, this is the formula funding. This money is allocated to each state Department of Transportation. The other $2.5 billion are discretionary funds that will be available through a competitive grant process. We don't know much yet about this grant program. We expect more information to be released later this year, but we do know that funding will be available to support EV charging as well as other alternative fuels. But we're here today again to talk about the NEVI program. So through this program, ODOT will receive $52 million over the next 5 years from the federal government. There is a 20% non-federal match required, which makes this a $65 million program in total. We will be looking to the private sector to provide some of these matching funds, but there may also be a public sector contribution to match as well, just to ensure that we are getting that adequate coverage across the entire state. For the first year, so fiscal year 2022, we can expect $7.7 million of these funds, which I'm sure some of you will notice is less than 1/5 of our total. The annual funding amounts for each of the next 4 years are still to be determined, but despite this lower amount in the first year, we still expect to get $52 million total over 5 years. And lastly, this funding must be spent on fast chargers along federally approved alternative fuel corridors. And we'll talk about where those are located in Oregon in a couple slides. So first, I'm sure many of you have heard by now of the Biden administration's goal to get to 500,000 public charging stations along our nation's highways. And the NEVI program is really the first step in reaching that goal. The objective of this federal program is to build a seamless national network of public EV charging that is reliable, convenient, affordable, and equitable. And the key requirements of this program really reflect this objective. They are meant to ensure a consistent user experience so that EV drivers know what to expect, no matter where they're charging their vehicle across the US. So some of these requirements include each site must have a minimum of 4 high-powered fast chargers to ensure redundancy. And high-powered in this case means a minimum of 150 kW. States are able to go above this minimum, and you'll see later that in Oregon, we intend to do just that. But at a minimum, each site must support 4 vehicles charging simultaneously at 150 kW. In addition, these stations must be located every 50 miles along those federally designated alternative fuel corridors, and they must be no more than 1 mile from those corridors. There will be an exception process for both of these requirements, but the federal government has made it clear that they are expecting a solid justification for why an exception is warranted in any given case. And in Oregon, we do expect we may need some exceptions, especially in our more rural areas, which Mary will talk about a little bit in a later slide. In addition, as part of this process, we are planning how to invest NEVI funding. We know that significant collaboration is not only expected of us, but also envisioned with agency partners, with industry, with environmental and equity stakeholders as well, and we'll also have a public process. We're going to be working very closely with our partner agencies at the Oregon Department of Energy and the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality as we refine this deployment strategy, but we're also planning targeted outreach with select stakeholder groups, and we'll be inviting public feedback throughout this process as well. And later on in the presentation, we'll go into a bit more detail about this specific stakeholder engagement process. And lastly, and importantly, a key requirement is that we develop a state plan that needs to be approved by the newly formed Joint Office of Energy and Transportation before any funding can be obligated or spent. So we know that this money needs to be spent along Oregon's alternative fuel corridors. These are highways throughout the state that have been previously nominated by ODOT and approved by the Federal Highway Administration as alternative fuel corridors for electric vehicles. We are well positioned in Oregon because we already have 7 of these approved corridors that provide pretty good geographic coverage across the state. You can see those on the map. We have 4 that run north-south. That's I-5, I-82, US 101, and US 97, and 3 that run from the west to the east, I-84, US 26, and US 20. Here in green, you can see our West Coast Electric Highway charging sites. This is a network of public fast chargers running from Canada to Mexico. And in Oregon, we have 44 of these West Coast Electric Highway sites. And here in blue, you can see all other existing public fast charging locations in the state. So you can see we have some work to do to really build out these corridors, not only to fill in the gaps, particularly in central and eastern Oregon, but also to provide that redundancy that is required by the NEVI program. Very few of these existing sites meet the current NEVI requirements. So we'll likely need to do upgrades as well as build new stations as part of this program. I will add that we do believe that the $52 million in NEVI funding plus the match, so the $65 million, is sufficient to build out these corridors. And we also hope to nominate additional corridors as well for that extra coverage. So in terms of a timeline for our first year, as you know, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was passed in November of 2021. And as required by the law, the USDOT then released its first set of guidance on February 10th of this year. This guidance was extensive and pretty directive, outlining the requirements I've already covered, as well as providing a pretty detailed look at all the elements that are required in our state plan. On the same day that this federal guidance was released, the Federal Highway Administration also announced that they would be opening another round of the Alternative Fuel Corridor Program. So we do have another opportunity to nominate additional corridors until May 13th of this year. Also on May 13th, the USDOT will be releasing its next set of guidance that will focus on minimum standards and requirements of the EV chargers that are installed at each site. This includes standards around data collection, network connectivity, payment options, and interoperability, among other things. But while all of this is happening, there is the expectation that states are already working on their state plans, both in collaboration with the partners that I've already outlined and in close communication with the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. These state plans are then due to the Joint Office by August 1st, and the federal government has until September 30th to notify states whether or not their plans are approved. They are accepting rolling submissions, so we do have the opportunity to submit our plan before that August 1st deadline, and that is exactly what we hope to do in Oregon. And as I've mentioned as well, the Joint Office has made it clear that this is a very collaborative process. We'll have a lot of opportunities along the way over the next several months to work with the Joint Office and to make sure that our plan complies with all of the federal requirements that have been outlined for us before we officially submit our plan. And once we do get word that our plan has been approved, we can then move forward with our plans for dispersing the funding. So we've talked a lot about the state plan, and now I just want to highlight a few of the key elements. This is not an exhaustive list of everything that needs to be in the state plan, but some of the key elements that we'll be making sure that we cover. First, I mentioned this is a 5-year plan for spending our NEVI dollars, and it is due to the Joint Office by August 1st. The first year of spending will be especially emphasized in our plan this year, and then we'll have the opportunity to update our plan on an annual basis. As well, this plan should identify existing conditions within Oregon. So in particular, the federal government is interested in where EV charging already exists, as well as the needs, risks, and challenges of future EV charging deployments in the state. Of course, we'll have to discuss our deployment strategy. So how do we plan to distribute these funds in a way that allows us to meet our goals for the plan and the vision of the program overall? This includes which corridors are planned for new and upgraded installations, some approximate locations of EV charger installations, our plans for private sector collaboration, and the source of that non-federal match. In addition, we'll need to demonstrate how our strategy will ensure that 40% of all benefits to EV charging accrue to disadvantaged communities as part of President Biden's Justice 40 initiative. We know that these benefits include more than just increased access to EV charging and get into labor and workforce development. And Mary's going to go into a little bit more detail about Justice 40 in an upcoming slide. In addition, I've already mentioned the plan will include our robust stakeholder engagement process that will again emphasize this first year in our initial plan, but also provide an overview of the full scope of our expected stakeholder engagement over our 5 years of NEVI spending. And then lastly, in the first year, we're required to establish program goals and performance metrics so that we can report on progress over time as part of our updates to the annual plan each year. And that is a little bit about the federal requirements for this program. I'm now going to turn things over to Mary to discuss our current strategy for meeting these requirements.
Thanks, Jillian, for that overview of the NEVI state plan and process. This probably seems like a lot to pull together in just a few months, and that's because it is. However, we are well positioned to develop the state plan due to the groundwork laid through our Transportation Electrification Infrastructure Needs Analysis, or TINA study. As many of you know, Governor Brown directed ODOT to undertake the TINA study last year, exploring the full range of transportation electrification charging needs across the state to meet our EV goals over the next 15 years. And while we looked at a range of use cases, we most closely examined the charging infrastructure needs for light-duty electric cars and trucks. Our consultant team started off with a review of existing conditions, and TINA also included a robust stakeholder engagement process. So, as Amanda mentioned, TINA found that we need a 5-fold increase in EV charging over the next 5 years. And I'd like to emphasize 2 other key findings. One, Oregon has both rural and urban charging deserts, with gaps in rural areas and gaps in urban neighborhoods where access to home charging for those living in apartments is scarce. These are often in low-income and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. The second finding is that it's critically important for Oregon to prioritize equity in future publicly funded EV charging infrastructure investments to overcome private sector hesitancy to invest in less developed EV markets and ensure access for all Oregonians. So even prior to NEVI, ODOT has been strategizing about how best to center equity in our work moving forward to ensure access to EV charging for all Oregonians. Next slide. As Jillian mentioned, as part of President Biden's Justice 40 initiative, 40% of the benefits of EV charging funds are to flow to communities defined as disadvantaged through Justice 40 guidance. The purple areas on this map illustrate the location of Justice 40 disadvantaged communities in Oregon, and the map also highlights Oregon's 7 alternative fuel corridors. The Justice 40 goal is really designed to ensure that a broader range of benefits accrue to disadvantaged communities, in addition to greater access to EV charging. Benefits such as jobs, training, apprenticeship opportunities, health benefits, and more. We will work with regions and communities along each corridor as it approaches build-out to tailor how best to address these goals. And additional guidance is anticipated from the federal government, and ODOT will follow that guidance carefully. Next slide. This diagram illustrates what an Oregon NEVI-funded EV charging station will look like. To provide some perspective, in Oregon today, many of the EV charging stations have only 1 or 2 DC fast chargers at a power level of 50 kilowatts. NEVI requires that EV charging stations have 4 DC fast chargers, each at a power level of 150 kilowatts and able to be operated simultaneously at full power. Our Oregon Quad Pod will also have 4 DC fast chargers, 3 at a power level of 150 kilowatts and 1 at a power level of 350 kilowatts, And we aim to add future proofing for 2 additional 350 kilowatt chargers. This Oregon quad pod design will better enable today's and tomorrow's EVs to charge quickly and power up some medium duty vehicles like large pickup trucks and delivery vans as well. The design anticipates future demand for faster charging, growing adoption of EVs, while future-proofing in ways that minimize station build-out costs today. The NEVI guidance also indicates that charging stations should be spaced no more than 50 miles apart within 1 mile of an exit ramp. And while we plan to meet these spacing requirements much of the time, Oregon will seek exceptions in some rural areas where there are few or no commercial establishments within the 50-mile spacing. Charging stations are likely to be sited no further than 75 miles or so when these exceptions arise. Next slide. So now let's talk about our deployment strategy. First, we are going to partner with the private sector. ODOT's implementation role is managing the distribution of funds, selecting projects, and assuring that the infrastructure gets built out. The fund recipients will build, manage, and maintain the EV charging infrastructure, not the Oregon Department of Transportation. Rather, ODOT will work through public-private partnerships with private sector companies to install and upgrade charging stations and maintain and operate these stations, as we do for the West Coast Electric Highway. Utilities and nonprofits can be important collaborators in these initiatives as well. We're going to pair corridors. Our game plan is to pair corridors each year in competitive RFPs, requests for proposals, for build out of one or more entire corridor. ODOT's near-term focus is to ensure that areas with few to no EV charging stations today get built out sooner. We aim to couple these investments with opportunities to add NEVI stations along portions of corridors in areas with higher concentration of EV drivers today to build greater private sector interest in the near term. Remember, there are going to be 50 states seeking EV charging infrastructure investments along corridors at the same time. So we want to present Oregon's opportunities for corridor investments in ways that meet the state's priorities while appealing to potential charging company partners. We just talked about building new, and we're also going to try and upgrade existing charging. ODOT aims to leverage the significant investments already made in fast charging stations and locations in Oregon. As Jillian mentioned, only a handful of Oregon's fast charging stations today meet NEVI standards. Our charge with this funding is to ensure that all EV alt-fuel corridors have stations that meet or exceed NEVI standards. So we're planning to offer the opportunity for EV charging station upgrades along selected corridors phased in over time. We're still working out how best to provide opportunities for this upgrade support. We're also going to target reliability. Our focus will be to fund partners with a proven track record building, operating, and maintaining charging stations with high levels of reliability and with the staying power to be in the market well beyond the 5 years of the NEVI program. Furthermore, we're going to be expecting our private sector partners to work with stakeholders in our communities and meet the spirit and the requirements of the Justice 40 goals. This year, we aim to finalize decisions about which the fiscal year 2022 corridors and regions will be eligible for build out and EV charging station upgrades by early summer. We're also going to try and expand our coverage. Our goal is to fulfill the TINA vision that EV charging is as ubiquitous and as convenient as fueling with gasoline along Oregon's EV alt-fuel corridors. To that end, we'll be evaluating how best to manage investments so that we can expand beyond the current 7 alternative fuel corridors in place today. Of course, as we develop and refine our strategies, we will be collaborating with a broad range of stakeholders. Again, this is a marathon, not a sprint. There will be many refinements along the way. Next slide. As Jillian mentioned, over the past 5 years, Oregon has proposed the current set of 7 EV alternative fuel corridors. These are shown in gray on the map. In an effort to expand the opportunity to fund corridor EV charging, either through the NEVI funds or through competitive federal grants, ODOT is considering proposing more EV alternative fuel corridors to achieve greater coverage and connectivity across the state. This map contrasts existing EV alt fuel corridors in gray with routes in blue that we will be considering proposing as alt fuel corridors over time. These include routes in Eastern Oregon, interstates along I-205, I-405 in the greater Portland area, and state highways that connect Central Oregon and the coast. The alt fuel corridor nomination process will occur annually, and ODOT will take a measured approach, phasing in proposals of new alt fuel corridors over time. But we're going to be determining in the next few weeks which corridors to propose this year, since applications are due to the Federal Highway Administration by May 13th. Next slide. Working with stakeholders. So I want to kick off this discussion by asking for your help. The federal government has set a goal that we build out charging stations within 6 months of funding being obligated. This is a big lift. We will need a village to make this happen. We need your involvement and your help to do this well, to center equity, and to build out EV charging infrastructure as quickly as possible. Our NEVI engagement is also a marathon, not a sprint. The outreach we're conducting right now before our first year state plan is due by August will focus on introducing the program while setting the stage for 5 years worth of engagement. And we recently talked to the joint office to clarify that, and they corroborated that they want to see plans for how we will engage with stakeholders as we build out corridors over time. And they don't want to see rushed efforts that don't truly engage with communities in meaningful ways. So ODOT intends to engage with a broad range of stakeholders, share information and listen, provide ways for you to meaningfully shape the 5-year plan, keep an open mind regarding what's working, what's not working, and find ways to improve. And we will be developing a comprehensive stakeholder plan, engagement plan for this first year that contains the specific elements I'll outline on the next slide and provides an overview of the plan for the following 4 years. Next slide. How can you engage? So here's our initial stakeholder engagement game plan. By the end of April, we will post a NEVI webpage that will house information about the program and what we're doing, and also host a public virtual open house, which will be our outreach to you and how you can connect with us, including an interactive map where you can share your ideas for charging station locations, and a quick survey so you can help ODOT and others plan for future electric vehicle charging station needs. Specifically, the survey will include a way for you to virtually raise your hand and let us know you're interested in potentially being a site host for an EV charging station or get involved in other ways. We're also going to be conducting targeted outreach to stakeholder groups. In May and June, we'll plan to virtually meet with a variety of stakeholder groups, such as EV charging companies, utilities, cities and counties, EV drivers and advocates, and Justice 40 communities, to share information, solicit your help in making sure that EV charging is built out well, expeditiously, centering equity, and to understand your concerns. By early summer, there'll be an opportunity to review elements of the draft state plan, and the state plan is then due in August, on August 1st. After that, we'll host regional workshops to more fully engage with regions and communities along selected corridors to explore NEVI charging opportunities, as well as other electric mobility options. In addition, we'll be hosting future webinars, public service announcements, TINA advisory group meetings, webpage updates, and more. So stay tuned. And now I'd like to turn it over to Suzanne Carlson, Director of the Climate Office.
Good morning, everyone. Suzanne Carlson, Director of ODOT's Climate Office, as Mary just stated. And as you've heard, Oregon is extremely well prepared to implement the National EV Infrastructure Funds, and we have a strong planning framework as well as a lot of upcoming opportunities for engagement. It fits into a bigger puzzle of what ODOT is working on to prepare for transportation electrification. This includes, as many of you know, the West Coast Electric Highway that we've had for over a decade, which has stations from British Columbia to the Mexico-California border, with 44 stations in Oregon. And we're presently upgrading those, adding a couple of new ones and making sure they accommodate e-bikes. You've heard about our alternative fuel corridors and opportunities to expand those. This year, we'll also be launching a community charging rebate program. So this opportunity will be focused more specifically on communities, working with communities to find out charging locations that might work best for them and providing a rebate, and specifically targeting low-income communities, rural areas, and apartment buildings and other specific charging needs. We know that the corridor charging is not going to provide everything for everyone. So this is another great opportunity. We're also following up with our TINA study. We're getting ready to come out with a study on hydrogen, and we're doing a study right now on e-micromobility. So whereas this webinar is really focused on that corridor opportunity, we will be supporting, as Amanda said, we know personal cars are not the only part of the picture. So we'll be working to support large delivery vehicles, small micromobility, and lots of needs in between. We're also developing tools to help local planners with specific zero emission vehicle deployment strategy coming to fill out the picture and user-friendly planning tools. And lastly, we'll be seeking every opportunity, and I think Oregon will be pretty competitive to go after other federal funding. So you saw in one of the first slides that there's discretionary grant opportunities, meaning competitive grants. So we're planning to go after those and really round this out, as well as the additional state funds that Amanda talked about that we'll be devoting here. So with that, I'll be brief. We want to get to your questions and make sure we've covered all the ground, and I'll hand it back to Matt Noble.
Thanks, Suzanne. All right, so that wraps up the presentation portion. So now we go for the Q&A. And luckily I gave out the wrong link to someone, so there's a second Matt Noble right now floating around. See guys, we couldn't do this without at least one little hiccup. So thank you, Matt Noble, for being me as well. So yes, Q&A time. So how this will work is you all have been dropping amazing questions in the Q&A. So thank you. We currently have 47 to get through. So we have about 25 minutes. So we will try to get through as many as we possibly can. I'll be reading them out live to our panelists and they'll be answering them. But please keep asking them in the chats. While I'm keeping a record of everything, and we will follow up with all of you because luckily your names are all tied to everything. And we have all of your email addresses from the invites. So if we don't get to you today, we will follow up with email. We'll have a recording of this session as well available that you can view on the ODOT YouTube. And I will also make the slides available as well. So you should be getting all those links. So if we don't get you today, don't freak out. All right, starting at the top. Can you guys address how e-bike charging will be part of an all electric vehicle charging schemes? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Matt. I can take that one. So as Suzanne mentioned, we are in the midst right now of doing a study on e-micromobility or electric micromobility. So looking at the key barriers to adoption of e-bikes and e-scooters and some actionable strategies that we can undertake to make sure that we can increase adoption of these mobility options. As in terms of how we'll address e-bike charging, we're going to be opportunistic as we move forward with including 110 volt outlets in our public investments of these charging stations. This is something we're already doing with the West Coast Electric Highway. All the upgrades will include 110 volt outlet for e-bike charging at those sites. And we're certainly going to follow that strategy as we work to disperse NEVI funding. Again, that funding is focused on charging for light duty vehicles, but we'll be adding e-bike charging where it makes sense at those sites.
All right, thank you, Jillian. Up next, please address big gaps and charging deserts for rural Oregon. So gaps including no charges between I-5 and Sisters and Highway 20. Highway 58 has no fast charging. There's no fast charging between Bend and other places on US 97. So can you guys discuss the gaps, these charging desert gaps?
Yeah, I think I can address those in the sense that we recognize all those gaps exist, and most of those routes are either existing alt fuel corridors or proposed alt fuel corridors. So 97, 20, I can't remember the other ones, but we will be, through the NEVI funding over the next 5 years, be implementing the NEVI standard charging station, the Oregon version of that, at 50-mile intervals where it's possible on those corridors.
Mary, if I might add, and just seeing a lot of the questions in there, I think there's a lot of questions in general about the process for identifying additional alternative fuel corridors and how we're selecting those. So I'll just start by saying briefly that we're trying to create a backbone system across the state to have interconnectivity north to south and east to west. And so the main already existing corridors kind of do that, but there's some key gaps, many of which are highlighted in the Q&A section by specific route name and number. And I think those, as Mary mentioned, align well with some of the proposed ones that we're looking at as well. But that is the backbone system. And then the other thing I just say too is that this webinar right now is really focused on the NEVI funding. So that's the federal funding, the $52 million that we're getting. There's additional and broader plans, as I kind of mentioned at the onset of this, to address the charging needs more holistically. So some of the requirements that you see here about like 50-mile spacing of stations, that really comes with the federal requirements that are rolled down to us, that we have to spend the money in certain ways to meet those federal requirements. So Mary, is there anything else you want to say about the process for identifying the?
I would just say that the federal government gives us guidance that they first and foremost are emphasizing interstates as alternative fuel corridors. And so that is, currently we only have interstates and US highways as approved alt fuel corridors. Some of the alt fuel corridors that we're considering proposing, and we're planning to propose, are state highways, but we've never gotten those approved before. So if you just think about this particular funding opportunity, what they are trying to do is create interconnected interstates across the United States, and that's the focus.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Right. So just for everyone in chat, please use the Q&A function to drop your question down. That's how we're tracking everything. It's just easier that way for us to kind of see what we've already answered and whatnot. But I am also recording the chat as well. So we'll get back to you if we don't get your question today. So moving on to a question from someone else. Are existing electric vehicle driver / advocate groups included in the stakeholder groups? And if not, how can they make sure that they're included in all of our outreach?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Mary. So yeah, I was just going to jump in. Yes, definitely we'll be reaching out to existing EV drivers and EV advocate groups. I would say if you want to make sure that you're included, please reach out to Mary or myself, and we'll make sure you're on the list. The other thing that you can do is sign up at our listserv on our TINA website right now, and that will be a really good way to stay informed of when these opportunities come up, and then you can make sure that you're tuned in for that.
Yeah, we will be working with existing groups of EV drivers and trying to make sure that we get together a focus group type setup and outreach specifically with EV drivers. We know you have opinions.
Thank you, guys. And just for clarification, quick question, are commercial or public transit vehicles considered under the NEVI program, or is it restricted to light duty? What's the difference?
So far, the guidance has been exclusively on light duty EV charging stations. There will be a designation for freight corridors in the alternative fuel corridor program, but we do not have any indication yet that there will be either guidance directing us to spend money on medium and heavy duty with these funds, or whether there'll be some other funding program down the road. My current thinking, and based on our conversations with the Federal Highway Administration and the Joint Office, is that there will be, the freight corridors are anticipating a future funding opportunity down the road that might leverage those corridors.
Thanks, Mary. Changing topics a little bit. So someone asked, the definition of fast charging varies. Are we considering level 2 240 volt, and level 3 DC fast charging as fast charging, or what's the differentiation there?
So the federal guidance defined fast charging for the purpose of this funding opportunity as DC fast charging at 150 kilowatts or higher.
Thank you, Mary. Here's a good question. I mean, these are all good questions. In the next in a series of good questions, will there be any attempt to use renewable energy to power the charging stations? Do we know anything about that yet?
I can jump in here. Yeah, so again, the federal government is very prescriptive in how we can use this funding. And they have said in their initial set of guidance that renewable energy installations are eligible if they work to reduce operating costs at the charging site. So this is something that will really need to be determined on a site-by-site basis as we move forward in our strategy development.
Hey, I want to just jump in and give a shout out to the Department of Environmental Quality's Clean Fuel programs that has the renewable energy credits. So because of that program, there will likely be a lot of interest in providing renewable energy for the charging stations.
All right, thank you both. Let's see. So here's a question about, I guess, who kind of owns and operates the chargers in that vein. So some people have had experiences with West Coast electric highway chargers like not working, or other public chargers not working, or maybe they're just out of order or slow. And it's been hard to get people to come out and fix them. So is there any specific reliability or uptime or maintenance requirements baked into the federal guidance that these private charging companies need to follow?
I can take that one again. So in my presentation, I talked about the two sets of guidance that are coming out of the federal government around this program. The 180-day guidance that we're expecting in May will outline exactly those types of standards and minimum specifications for these chargers. So they will definitely have requirements around the things you mentioned: reliability, uptime, and maintenance response.
Well, and the guidance, Jillian, did you say this? I was distracted. The guidance specifies greater than 97% reliability in order to be funded. And we haven't exactly figured out how to ensure that, but one possibility is to withhold some of the funds to make sure that those kinds of operational targets and metrics are met.
Thank you, Mary. So we've had a number of questions about the RFP process, so the request for proposal process. How do private companies get, to use the pun, plugged into ODOT for the funding? Can anyone expand on what we know about that process so far?
Okay, two things. The best and first thing to do is, until we get our NEVI webpage set up, sign up for our listserv on the TINA website. And once we get our NEVI site up, sign up there for our listserv. My understanding, I believe they changed the name. Amanda or Suzanne, maybe you can correct me. It used to be called ORPN, that you could sign up for to get notices of public charging requests for proposal opportunities in Oregon, but we will get back to you on that.
Thank you, Mary. So I had a question. Let's see. Will ODOT record for the NEVI deployment for all this infrastructure? Will ODOT create requirements for private sector businesses to create charging infrastructure that addresses affordability, accessibility, reliability, and other equity questions?
Yeah, so we do have our own set of minimum standards and specifications that we use in other programs like the West Coast Electric Highway. But again, the federal government in this case is setting those standards, and they will be released to us May 13th of this year.
Thanks, Jillian. Let's see, going through the list here, blah, 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 Electrify America. How are we, so here's a question. So we have a lot of existing charging stations under a bunch of different companies. How are we leveraging the existing infrastructure into this plan? Are they, I know we talked about some are being upgraded, some of it's new. How does that, where's that delineation?
Well, we haven't sorted out exactly what we're going to do, but we are going to create a program whereby we'll create opportunities for upgrades of existing stations. You know, we are not going to be necessarily picking and choosing those stations. We are probably going to be more agnostic and identify them by geography along select corridors. But it is certainly our intent to leverage all the hard work and the good work and the funding that has gone into creating existing sites and stations and those very valuable site host operator agreements. So that's, you know, we intend to try and create those opportunities, but we're still sorting that out.
Thank you, Mary. And I'm actually going to just send out a note to our 2 phone users right now. I know you guys are holding tight. Appreciate you joining us. If you have questions and you're on the phone, you can just dial *9, which will virtually raise your hand so I, the host, can see it. And then I will unmute you. So phone users, if you got a question, we're not going to skip you. Keep that in mind. All right. Another question that's had a lot of updates for you guys to answer is there funding to resource communities with low capacity who otherwise may not be able to engage with ODOT?
I think there will be opportunities for stakeholder engagement along the regions and the corridors when we develop regional workshops. And ODOT does have a mechanism whereby we can create opportunities for stakeholders who may need compensation to participate to get that opportunity. I'm not sure if that answers the question. We will be reaching out and trying to create ways of doing reaching you through a variety of different mechanisms. But
thank you, Mary. Let's see, pair corridors. So actually, Mary, someone asked you to clarify the pair corridors concept for the all fuel corridors. Could you explain that in a little more detail?
So if you look at our alt fuel corridor maps, you can see routes like parts of US 20 or US 97 that don't have a lot of EV charging along those right now. And our idea is to create a funding opportunity on an annual basis that pairs a corridor like one of those, or part of a corridor like one of those, with a corridor or part of a corridor like an I-5 or a US 101 or parts of I-84 closer to the Portland area that may have more charging and more attractiveness to charging companies, and because there are more EV drivers today in those general areas. So, but the challenge with this is to fold in the opportunities for upgrading the charging stations. And the other challenge for this really comes down to the money that we get. Every year, this year we get 7.7 million. We don't know yet how much money they're going to give us each year over the next few years. And we're going to have to evaluate the length of the corridors, the geography of the corridors, the need for additional spacing or lack thereof for corridors, and evaluate the existing stations that are on each of those corridors as we come up with these pairings. So I know that's not the clearest answer, but it should tell you how we're trying to think about them.
Thank you, Mary. All right, moving right along. We got about 7 minutes left. You guys are doing great. Thank you for all the questions. We're trying to get through as many as we can. So kind of coalescing a couple of different questions that we've seen come in. Will the funds and corridor applications be released on a predictable schedule or cadence? Any information about that?
We have asked the Federal Highway Administration that same question, and we don't have a good answer. They can't tell us yet how much money we're going to get each year, but there will be announcements for when the funding will be available. We just don't know that answer yet.
And I'll just
So
add.
Mary, I do think.
Oh, go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I was going to say, I think part of it is that idea of the corridors that you were talking about, where it's one very attractive one maybe more rural one that we want to just kind of go through and try to build out our network overall. So I think the idea is to do that roughly annually if we can. But as Mary said, it depends really how the federal funding comes.
All right, thank you both. So again, kind of combining some questions here. Some people are asking questions about who provides the real estate that these new charges will be built on. Some other people are saying available parking spots is one of the biggest challenges of installing these stations. Will there be money for land purchases or leasing? Is that in the plan?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I actually don't remember if land acquisition is an eligible cost, but that's something that will be directed by the federal government. So we'll have to look into that. And I'll add that the EV charging companies that the private sector that we work with and contract with will be responsible for finding site hosts for hosting these charging stations and, going through the process of developing those site host agreements. So that we will certainly help out with that process, but ultimately that is something that the charging companies are responsible for.
I concur with everything Jillian said, especially that I don't remember what the guidance states, but typically we have not compensated EV charging providers for land or site host acquisition.
All right, moving right along, and 4 minutes left. So what about electrification of ports, fleets, and other maritime assets? Will funding be awarded to coastal communities and their industries?
I'm just going to reiterate that to the extent that we have a coastal community that's on an electric vehicle alt-fuel corridor like US Highway 101, there will be opportunities for the NEVI funded charging stations at 50-mile intervals. But beyond that, while there is talk in the guidance that supports ports and intermodal opportunities and warehousing, there is not any specific direction in that regard.
I'll just mention briefly that this webinar is focused on this corridor opportunity with the NEVI funds, but we do look at having other state resources and then the federal discretionary grants, which jurisdictions besides ODOT can apply to those opportunities. So if you do have a specific request, that should be an opportunity. We will have the community charging grant program, and we'll have some technical assistance for that charging rebate program as well. So if a community is interested in a really targeted type of charging gap that they have, we'll have a consultant on board to talk you through that and find out if our rebate program is an opportunity. So there'll be some other resources coming forward too.
Thank you, Suzanne. All right, so we have about 2 minutes left. So panelists, we didn't discuss this beforehand, but have you guys been reading any Q&A questions? Have you guys been peeking? Is there anything you really want to answer that I may not get to? Anything you want to just throw out there in our final 2 minutes here? or I can ask another question while you guys read. It's up to you. Seeing nothing. Okay, cool. All right, then we will get back to one or two more questions here.
Matt, can I just say that one on security issues. So
Sure.
we know that security and vandalism can be a problem, especially in remote areas. And so that's why, to the extent possible, we're going to be encouraging site selection in areas where there are amenities of some sort and are more likely to be people and businesses around and in operation. The other thing is that one of the requirements of the state plan is that we address cybersecurity issues as well. So I'm not exactly sure how we are going to address cybersecurity, but we will we are being asked to do so.
Thanks, Mary. Panelists, anything else you want to add in our final minute here?
I think just thanks, folks, for getting online. Obviously, a lot of information here. Still more for us to figure out as we move forward in terms of getting additional federal guidance. As we said a couple of times, this is really focused on the NEVI funding because we have a specific plan and specific requirements that we need to meet as part of that. But we do have a much larger kind of portfolio effort around transportation electrification, such as what Jillian mentioned for the e-bikes and doing some studies on what are the barriers and opportunities, which may not just be the infrastructure charging itself, right, but other things as well. And so we definitely look at cost, awareness, infrastructure, and certainly trying to center equity in all that work that we do so that we truly try to have a rounded effort as we move forward, and this NEVI funding is a key piece of that. So we look forward to engaging with all of you more as we move forward, and just like to say thanks to my team, Suzanne, Mary, Jillian, for all the work that you're doing in moving this forward. So thank you all.
Thanks, Amanda. And thank you, panelists. You guys were excellent. Thank you, attendees. And just as we wrap up here, so remember, if you think of a question after this webinar, my email is in the chat. Please email me. I would love to talk to you, and I would love to pose your question to our panelists. We have roughly 68 questions we didn't get to today, so I will write those all down. I will group them up. We will answer them. We have all of our attendees' emails and your name, so we will send the answered questions out to everyone in the next week or so. This webinar is also being recorded, so that link will be coming out to your email as well. And we will also be sharing the PowerPoint presentation slides as well. But really the bottom line is, if you need anything, just shoot me an email. I will be happy to talk to you. And I believe that is it. So thank you all for joining us today. As Amanda said, this was super fun and hopefully the start of several webinars with all of you. Thank you very much and have an excellent Monday.
Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.